I really am happy to welcome back our old friend, Gary Kibel.
All right, thanks very much, Steve. I appreciate that. All right, I'm actually going to set my timer because I don't know how I'm going to keep all this to 15 minutes, but I intend to try. So privacy is kind of a hot topic, as you've heard lately. So I'm a partner at a law firm in New York, work with a lot of ad tech companies, agencies, brands, and media companies on these issues. This is who I am. If I fly through some slides and you want to get a copy later on, I'm happy to give you a redacted copy later on. And let's save Q&A until the roundtables at the end, since we only have a short amount of time. So here are some of the things that I'm going to talk about. What's going on with self-regulation in the industry, because it still exists. And then we'll talk about some of the new laws and the obligations that are out there. And then we'll talk about what's going on across the pond, because that's even crazier. So privacy is an important issue, and individual users are very concerned about their privacy, as this video will prove.
Hey, bro! Listen, I was trying to buy this handcrafted mahogany wood model of a B-25 Mitchell Panchito aircraft.
Aw, for me?
Don't sass me. And I went to this website, and this ad popped up that said, "Hey, Ron Swanson, check out this great offer."
What's your question?
My question is, what the hell?
Like, how do they know who you are?
Yeah.
Okay. There are these things called cookies, where, like, if you go to a site and buy something, it'll remember you and then create ads for other stuff you might want to buy.
So it learns information about me? Seems like an invasion of privacy.
Dude, if you think that's bad, go to Google Earth and type in your address.
Okay, so everyone's talking about privacy. It's a hot issue. And in the United States, it's kind of wacky. We don't have a federal privacy law. We have one sentence. In Europe, they have the GDPR, which is a big, meaty law. It applies to every member state. It applies to all personal data processing in all industries. It's a difficult law, but at least there's one standard. In the US, we don't have a federal law. This one sentence is the one sentence that governs the entirety of the advertising industry. If you have a car and you say it goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, but it's really 10 seconds, that's deception. If you have a privacy policy that says we will not use your information except as disclosed herein, and you don't comply with that, that's also deception. That's all the federal government can do right now. They have different laws for different specific issues like children's privacy, healthcare, financial services, but we don't have an overarching comprehensive consumer privacy law. So the states are jumping into this void. So there's still self-regulation out there, and this was before all the states came online with these new privacy laws. So the Digital Advertising Alliance, this is a collection of all the different trade associations in the industry, IAB, NAI, the ANA, the 4As, and they got together to try and keep all the regulation at bay by having a self-regulatory approach to the collection of data for advertising purposes. They published all these different principles, and you've seen it a zillion times online. You go to a website, and the ad pops up, and there's the ad choices icon. When you click it, you get disclosure, transparency about how your data is being collected, and then you've had the ability to opt out. And the idea was that the industry would put this in place, and then lawmakers would leave us alone. The NAI is also out there, but that's a member-only organization. When you join, you comply with their code of conduct. Well, it didn't keep the regulators at bay and the lawmakers at bay. So California came along as the first comprehensive consumer privacy law in the country. If this new law came out of, I don't want to insult anybody, out of Montana or Vermont or North Dakota, I think everyone would have ignored it. But it came out of California, so it was a big deal. What does it require? It requires 3 basic things. Greater transparency about what you collect in a privacy policy. It gives consumers, by law, certain rights they didn't have before to access their information, delete their information, and then most importantly, they can opt out of the sale of their personal information. And the place of a pixel or a tag on a website and collecting cookie-based or other data that has a persistent identifier, that's personal information, and letting the ad tech company grab it, that's a sale. So websites need to allow consumers the ability to opt out. And as I mentioned, personal information is very broad. IP, cookies, maids, everything. And selling is very broad. It's not giving the data to someone for cash. It's really giving some value exchange. Hey, you can put a tag on my site. I'll get great analytics. You get the data. That's a sale of personal information. So what are websites doing? You go to Target's website, scroll down to the bottom, you got the whole string of all the links there. Now you have a link that says, do not sell my personal information. And when you click that, a form comes up or a process to enable the consumer to opt out of these sales. Depending upon the data you're processing, this can be a very complex thing to do. If you just have name and email address, it's very easy. But if all you're processing is maids, it can be very complex. Individuals cannot sue under the California law unless there's a security breach. Just the Attorney General can bring an action, and they can impose fines. But it's awesome that it has a cure period. That's the greatest law in the world. You violate the law, and you got a chance to cure it. I mean, imagine being pulled over by the cop for driving 60 in a 30, and he goes, all right, I'll give you a chance to cure this violation if you drive slower. I mean, it's fantastic, a cure period. Now, one of the biggest things is when this came out and the industry was kind of freaking out about how do we comply with these opt-outs if all we're processing is cookies and maids, I could spend an hour talking about this. But the IAB came up with their program called the Limited Service Provider Agreement, LSPA. Very, very complex program. Long story short, when you sign this agreement and you join it, you are within an ecosystem of publishers and ad tech companies, and you agree to pass along a privacy string signal to one another to process the opt-out requests. This program's a bit complex. It's going to get radically more complex because I'm on a committee doing an update for this to comply with new laws that are coming out and applying next year. So definitely pay attention to what the IAB is doing there. So California gave us the CCPA, then California came along last November and voters enacted the CPRA. What is that? It's basically CCPA 2.0. The big thing for this industry is it brings in a definition of cross-context behavioral advertising, which is basically behavioral advertising. And it gives consumers the right to opt out of sharing of that cross-context behavioral advertising. And so now they can opt out not just of the sale of their personal information, but the mere sharing of their information for behavioral advertising. So those links at the bottom of the page need to talk about sharing as well. California also introduced the idea of sensitive personal information, such as geolocation, health data, financial data, and they're going to require yet another new link on the website that says, limit the use of my sensitive personal information. It's not an opt-in, but consumers have the ability to control how you use that type of sensitive data in an opt-out mode. And then perhaps the most impactful thing about this California law, CPRA, is it required them to build a brand new regulatory agency. This is going to be the nation's first standalone privacy regulatory agency, the California Privacy Protection Agency, CPPA. There's so many acronyms, CCPA, CPPA, the PTA, the FBI, there's tons. But you can imagine these guys have one job, to enforce privacy laws. That's what they're going to do. All the other regulators in the country have so many other things going on, they get distracted. These guys have one mission. They're going to be very aggressive. So, little known fact. There are 49 other states in the United States besides California. And they all want to get in on this cool privacy law thing too. So they are all jumping on board. Virginia was number 2, the Consumer Data Protection Act, the CDPA. So what does that require? Well, firstly, it takes effect January 1 of next year, the same day as the CPRA. It's an opt-out approach for the most part, like CCPA, and there's no right of individuals to file lawsuits. It gives consumers, again, the ability to opt out of the sale of their personal information. It has a definition of sensitive data that includes a broader scope of data, racial, ethnic, religious information, biometric, geolocation, actually defines it to 1,750 feet. These laws are getting crazy. They all define location differently. But here's the big thing. Virginia says if you want to process that sensitive data, it's got to be an opt-in. That's a radical change. So starting next year, you want to process that precise geolocation or the racial or ethnic information about the users in Virginia, it's got to be an opt-in basis, not an opt-out basis. Colorado, they were number 3, Colorado Privacy Act. It takes effect next year, but not until the middle of the year. It's similar to California and Virginia in many ways, and it also has the opt-in for sensitive data. But their definition of sensitive data does not include precise geo. That's why this is all getting so complex. Every state's doing it differently. They have mostly an opt-out process, but they have an opt-out, and Virginia has this as well, an opt-out for targeted advertising. Again, I could spend an hour talking about what does targeted advertising mean in the context of these laws. It's not post-delivery where you're doing measurement or attribution. It's not prior to delivering the ad where maybe you're doing lookalike modeling. It's the actual process of delivering the ad. And now consumers by law will have the right to opt out of those ads being delivered. The IAB is looking into that. Again, there's a cure period, a 60-day cure period, which is awesome, but they're going to sunset that cure period in 2025. So I talked about all these definitions, and that's what makes this so crazy and complex, because every state has their own definition about what all this stuff means. So everyone defines personal information or personal data. And again, going through my columns there, GDPR is Europe, CCPA and CPRA are California, then we have Virginia and Colorado. Another law, the fourth state coming online is Utah. The law was signed yesterday, and I think my law firm's putting out an alert on it on Monday. And that one's probably the most business-friendly of these laws that's come out so far. The Utah one is very friendly. Some of the states define sensitive personal information, but as I mentioned, California has an opt-out approach. Virginia and Colorado have an opt-in, but they define the data differently. Cross-context behavioral advertising, and then there's targeted advertising opt-out, which I think is going to become more of a trend. So how do you comply with all these obligations? I just started listing all these different obligations: the right to opt out, the right to limit use of sensitive information, the opt-in requirements. This is becoming really complex. And that's one thing on the IAB committees I'm involved in, trying to come up with one privacy string so there can be one link on a website or an app to let people exercise these rights. And what do? You might have to go with the strictest standard, because you can't parse all the data in different ways and try to go with different states. But some people might try to do that. So, press hard. Industry response. What's the industry doing? Well, you may know many things about this. So when CCPA first came out, Google gave us a tool to help with this. And they developed what's called restricted data processing, RDP, that you could go into your Google platform and you could basically silo the California users so that the data would not be considered a sale when it goes to Google, and that way you don't have to offer them an opt-out. And since it was only the California users that had this right, if you set RDP, you don't need to offer anyone the right to opt out. Facebook did something similar, limited data use, same thing. You go in there, you set limited data use, and they will silo those users. I don't know how the large platform is going to do this when now we have 4 states, and eventually it's going to be more states. You're not going to want to silo all these users because you'll have no users left. So it's probably going to be you need to comply with these opt-out and opt-in rights. We've talked lots about deprecation of cookies, so I don't need to talk about that. When Apple made the change in the collection of the IDFA unilaterally from an opt-out to an opt-in, that was a radical change for the industry. Not a law, but when Apple or Google do something, it obviously drives the entire industry. So when I kept playing my golf game, because I like golf, and I wanted to keep getting my gold coins there, of course, I got this pop-up, but of course, I always click allow because got to support the industry. So the UK, what's going on in the UK? Because there's a ton of things going on in the UK. And in my last 2 minutes, I mean, this could be an hour-long slide. The UK has always been, sorry, the UK, EU and UK, I always got to make sure I say both together. In the EU and the UK, it's always been challenging to collect data because of GDPR and to transmit it. So you have to have consent or a legal basis, it's called, to collect data such as cookie data in the EU and the UK. And so how do you do that? That's why you get all these pop-up banners. The cookie banner's not needed by law in the US, at least not yet. But in the EU, it is needed because you need to get some legal basis in order to process that cookie data. So the IAB Europe came up with the Transparency and Consent Framework. And it was basically a process built into these cookie banners, built into the CMPs, to get consent from a user to drop the cookie and then pass that consent off to all the participants in the IAB TCF program, all the ad tech companies. Well, there was a lawsuit filed by privacy advocates, and the Belgian Data Protection Authority about a few months ago came down with a ruling and basically said the TCF program violates GDPR. It's in violation right now for many, many reasons. Firstly, they didn't like any pre-checked boxes. They didn't like some of the legal basis that was being used. They said, you, IAB Europe, yourselves should be complying with the GDPR. You're not just a service provider. They fined the IAB 250,000 euros, and they said, we're giving you time to fix it. You got 2 months to come up with a remediation plan, and then once that remediation plan is approved, you got 6 months to implement it. So as we sit here today, anyone collecting data through a cookie banner in the EU or the UK pursuant to the IAB TCF program, I would say you're collecting tainted data. That's being done all over the place. But I think the regulators are kind of giving the industry a little bit of time to work this out. The IAB Europe is appealing this ruling, but the appeal doesn't stay. Darth Vader says I'm almost done here. Okay. But they're coming out with a remediation plan, which is going to be, they've already have it roughly in place, and they're going to deliver it to regulators soon. Google Analytics, separate privacy lawsuit, basically determined that Google collecting data in Europe through Google Analytics and transmitting it across the pond to the US violates law. Think how many websites use Google Analytics. This is an actual ruling right now, and that's why Google's trying to change the way the analytics program works. Very last thing I'll say, new and pending federal legislation. It's going to come eventually. They are concerned about things such as this, that people getting mailings because of big data that are really scary. And this is an actual mailing someone got from Office Max. Mike Say, daughter killed in car crash or current business. Regulators are terrified about this type of data. And sometimes people get this data to suppress certain offers, not to use it for inappropriate ways. I mean, I got an interesting one at my home once. I got this catalog for the wine enthusiast, and it was addressed to my son. And I thought that was a little bit strange because my son was not interested in wine at that time. So regulators don't like the way data is being used in our industry. But with that, I'll skip the last slide, and I stayed pretty close to my 15 minutes, right?
You're, man. You're the
right.
man. You have always been the man. And we do have time for questions. Come on.
Okay.
Gary's been so great. Let's, anybody have any quick questions for Gary?
Yeah, shoot me an
Yes.
email, and I'll shoot you a redacted copy of the slides. Yep.
What's worse? Thank you. What's worse, having a patchwork of laws and needing to abide by the most conservative one, or having a federal mandate? Like, if you were just like personify the IAB in the industry for a moment, what's worse?
Yeah, it's a great point. One of the most important things is if a federal law comes out, it needs to preempt all the state laws, and there's a debate about that they might actually pass laws that don't preempt the state laws. That's a nightmare, because now instead of 50 standards, you'll have 51 standards. I mean, I think that having a federal law would make things easier for the industry. There's some talk in Congress that instead of that we need a federal law because all these states are passing their own, there's some in Congress who are like, oh, we don't need to deal with it because the states are handling it, and we got so many other things to do. But I just think it's getting so much more complex for industry. It's not going to happen this year because in the midterms. Hopefully next year. I think the most thing you likely might get a new law on some little issue like children's privacy or location privacy. But I think we really need the federal law, but I don't think it's coming soon.
Gary, what's your top line advice? I know this is oversimplifying. What's your top line advice to ad tech, to publishers, to agencies when they come at you and say, what the hell? What do I do now to protect myself? What's the first thing I need to do?
To understand what data that you're responsible for, what data your partners are responsible for, and then to not really point the finger, but make sure you have a contract that identifies who's going to be responsible for certain compliance. Like if you're an agency and you're just pulling the levers, but you don't really touch the data, you have limited obligations. But if you're the ad tech company receiving the data and processing the data, you might have heightened obligations, and if you're a publisher, you're on the front lines.
Gary Kibel, thank